Good afternoon. On behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Marcia Mintz. I'm the Managing Director of the Center. We are an academic research center housed in Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. The center was established in 2002 to encourage thoughtful discussion and to share information on a wide range of economic issues in the public interest. The Georgetown on the Hill series is one of our venues, one of our favorite venues, and we are so delighted that you are here to join with us today. I'd like to introduce to Bob or Brad, I'm introducing Bob Vastine.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcia. Go ahead. Hi, Bob Vastine. I'm a senior fellow at the center. It's great to have you all here. This is a really great turnout and a really interesting subject. Hi, Dan. How are you? International trade, I hear it on NPR, so it has to be true, is high on the post-election agenda. Perhaps most important is Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, and of course two closely linked, highly important negotiations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. Intended to have been negotiated quickly on, quote, one tank of gas, TTIP's tank appears to be empty. Europeans blame the absence of TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, and U.S. concentration on the TPP. The U.S. is concerned with EU intransigence on some very important and contentious issues. TTIP was announced in June 2013 with presidential fanfare and exceptionally far-reaching goals after months of consideration by a joint high-level working group. Issues such as the protection of foreign investment, data flows, geographic indicators, and trade in services, including cultural and maritime services, are among the issues holding up the talks. One of the most ambitious goals, building regulatory compatibility, has stalled on the United States, partly on the United States' refusal to include financial services. The stakes are really very high. It's a very serious undertaking. Every day, goods and services worth more than $2 billion, $2.7 billion are traded between Europe and the US, and which together account for half of world GDP. Some have questioned whether TTIP's goals were too ambitious and should be scaled back. Many believe TTIP is too important to abandon or downsize. The question is, how can it be restarted? So we're really fortunate to have a really excellent panel to discuss this issue. I am privileged to say they are all friends, some of them of very long standing. We're going to begin with Chuck Levy, partner in Cassidy, Levy & Kent. Chuck and I first traveled to Europe on a Codel to Brussels to learn more about the European community in 1973. I was a child. Yeah, and I was 21. He is one of Washington's most distinguished and wise trade counsel, here speaking on his own behalf. Linda Dempsey is a pillar of the Washington trade community. She was on the staff of the Senate Finance Committee when we met, then was vice president of the Emergency Committee for American Trade, where I worked when it was founded in 1968. She is now vice president of International Economic Affairs at NAM. Kathryn Hauser is managing partner, Policy Connections International, and former U.S. executive director of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, the TAB-D. Bringing to bear her experience at USTR, Kathryn has been at the very heart of the long effort to resolve differences and build bridges between the EU and the US. Playing cleanup is Tim Bennett, Director General and CEO of the Transatlantic Business Council. Tim has an exceptional background in public policy. He's been president of the former Cybersecurity Industry Alliance and executive vice president of the American Electronics Association. He has been a USTR negotiator, and we're very glad that Tim is here today, partly to remind us that the TTIP glass may not be brim full, but it is certainly not empty. Our moderator is Brad Jensen, my co-conspirator and partner in crime in creating these and other events for the Georgetown Center. Brad is professor of international business and economics at the McDonough School. He's author of the book on services trade called Global Trade and Services, Facts, Fears, and Offshoring. Brad Jensen.
So my modest role here is just to serve as timekeeper. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chuck.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. I think this is a extremely important topic for everyone to think about. Before getting to the subject of the meeting, I'd like to just make a couple of general comments. I think first, I'd like to take a moment to thank the U.S. and EU negotiators for their work to date. They don't have an easy job politically or substantively with this negotiation. TTIP is not your normal FTA. It's really the first time that two of the world's economic and political giants, in essence two equals, have tried to negotiate an FTA with each other. And no one should underestimate how difficult that environment is. Also, while it is never kind to find any enjoyment in someone else's problems, I have to confess, excuse me, that I'm getting a small degree of pleasure out of the new political debate in Europe over the benefits of trade and investment agreements. For years, my European friends have chided me about how is it possible that we in the United States can have such intense debates over the benefits of trade and investment agreements when the benefits are so clear. Well, now that the Europeans have their own debate over the benefits of trade agreements and the benefit of TTIP, I am getting some satisfaction in telling them that the key to winning is for the EU to follow our example, and that is for the private sector to mobilize and to get into the fight. And most importantly, for European political leaders to have the guts to stand up to opponents and not just always look for compromises. So that is sort of just to get that off my chest. I think it's wonderful that Europe's having this debate, and I'm sure that they will come out on the right side of that debate. Now to the subject of our meeting. In thinking about the future of TTIP, it serves no purpose for any of us to get overly excited about the fact that TTIP was supposed to be negotiated on one tank of gas, because it won't be, and never would be, in my opinion. That was a very clever soundbite to deal with the then current political environment. But it was an unrealistic goal given the complexity of issues and the fact that transatlantic trade and investment is essentially open, leaving only the most difficult nuts to crack. The new EU Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, showed what I think is good political judgment and courage when she called for a restart of the negotiations. She understood that negotiations appeared to be just marking time, and the negotiators are to a significant degree plagued by the hard nuts of unresolved old issues and the complexity of new issues. She recognized the problem and confronted it rather than let it fester. I would sort of submit that we don't have to restart the negotiation because I don't think they ever really stopped and have made some progress. I rather think of it sort of as borrowing from a Coca-Cola jingle. It's the pause that refreshes. Because the issue confronting the U.S. and the EU today is what needs to be done to refresh and reinvigorate the negotiations rather than restart them. To refresh and reinvigorate the negotiations, I sort of have come to the conclusion there are several actions that the U.S. and the EU need to take. I think the first is that everyone needs to recognize that TPP is first in line. I know this is hard for our EU friends to accept, but the reality is TPP is in the final stretch, hopefully, and it needs the full attention of the administration, Congress, and the private sector to get it over the finish line as early as possible next year. Second, I think everyone should really take a step back for a second to the beginning and recognize that TTIP is much more than just another FTA. While TPP is hopefully going to be a 21st century agreement in international trade and investment terms, TTIP is very much more of a regular FTA. TPP is much more of a regular FTA. TTIP, on the other hand, I think of in terms much more as a foreign economic policy agreement in a broader sense than a standard FTA. It should focus on forging a new relationship in what I think are three core areas. First, it should create a more open transatlantic market, which is a traditional FTA element. Second, It should create a system for closer and more coordinated partnership in engaging third countries on improving and enforcing the ground rules for international trade and investment, which requires more than the traditional FTA type relationship. And third, it should create a new framework to deal with regulatory issues, which is clearly not covered by traditional FTAs and which is truly a 21st century imperative for global economic engagement. Third, political leaders in the US and EU will need to reinvigorate their political support for the negotiations and provide stronger and more direct pressure on their negotiators to push forward and to take chances in the negotiation. This is a tough negotiation. You've got to take chances in this negotiation. Fourth, given the fact that the US and EU have been trying to crack the hard nuts for years, it's important to make sure that the government and the private sector position papers and talking points on these important issues aren't just being taken off the shelf and redeployed. Every effort needs to be made to re-examine the issues and explore whether there are new and creative ways to achieve the objectives that are very important. Fifth, during the Uruguay round in NAFTA, there was a very interactive relationship between private parties in the United States and their foreign counterparts in developing ideas and promoting solutions to the issues, and equally important, close cooperation and joint efforts to develop and maintain political support for the negotiations. I was very lucky to have been counsel to the U.S. Group of companies that pushed for on the TRIPS agreement, in which, when confronted by both the U.S. government, the EU, Japan, other members of the GATT at the time, they said, "Oh, we can't negotiate TRIPS and IP in GATT. It's much too complicated. We have WIPO, and what the U.S. industry did was, in cooperation with Japanese industry and European industry, we actually spent a year or plus, 18 months, negotiating our own model TRIPS agreement, which we released in joint press conferences around the world. And if you actually go back and look at our model agreement, it actually is the foundation for what TRIPS was. And we went to the governments and said, come on, if the three industries, if the three, US, European, and Japanese industry can figure out how to negotiate a TRIPS agreement, the governments with more resources certainly can. This is the type of effort that really is needed in the TTIP context. And by all reports, there are some really good initiatives underway. There was a report this week in Inside U.S. Trade about how U.S. and EU manufacturing groups are building common ground. The U.S. automotive and chemical industries are cooperating. These initiatives need to be strongly supported and encouraged by the governments and by companies and by their associations. New initiatives are needed to be promoted to fill gaps where there is not enough cooperation. And these types of initiatives need to be intensified, especially in terms of joint US-EU efforts to build and maintain political support. Sixth, during the Uruguay round and NAFTA here from the US perspective, there were extensive substantive consultations between negotiators and private interested parties in discussing negotiating strategies, proposals, and outcomes. Over the last 20 years, based on my experience, that type of relationship has atrophied. And the issues in TTIP are so substantively and politically complex. I believe it's essential for both the US and EU negotiators to abandon the current, what I believe is a static consultative relationship with the private sector, and find a way to recreate the type of dynamic working relationship that helped push through the Uruguay round and NAFTA, which in their own right, if you look back, were pushing trade and investment agreements into new areas and new structures. I don't think you would have had the Uruguay round or NAFTA succeed if you hadn't had this dynamic consultative relationship between business and government. And this private sector, not just business, but NGOs too. And I think if we don't replicate that in TTIP, we're running a risk of not getting the full force behind such an important negotiation. Finally, I don't think we should panic and undermine the process of negotiating TTIP by lowering the initial ambition for TTIP. An agreement of this magnitude and importance is worth taking time to get it right. So if I was philosopher king, I would ban all this discussion about lowering ambitions and simply get down to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Linda?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brad, Bob, for having me here today and putting together such a great event as usual. The National Association of Manufacturers, if you're not familiar, is the largest industrial trade association here in the United States. We represent over 14,000 manufacturers, most of them small, medium-sized companies that manufacture here. And there are over 12 million jobs, manufacturing jobs in this country, and many more supported by manufacturing. And if you've been concerned about the health of manufacturing in the United States, I would tell you that manufacturing production has been on the rise, and last year we were at our highest level ever of $2.08 trillion. And I know from working with Brad before that it's always good to point out that manufacturers work with our farm community, work with our service providers, and we need each other. Many of the products that we manufacture contain our great food and agricultural products that I see my Farm Bureau friend over there. And we need the services, obviously, to get our products around the country and into foreign markets. And so all of these issues really come together. But I will be focusing on manufacturing a lot today since those are the folks that I represent. Trade and investment are powerful forces for growth and competition for our nation's manufacturers, our farmers, our service providers, and for the industries and jobs in countries around the world. Trade sustains and creates jobs and has brought billions of people out of poverty. Trade is a force for economic growth. Manufacturers in the United States have seen our exports quadruple over the last 20 years. There's over $11 trillion in manufactured goods traded worldwide. But we face a lot of pressure, particularly from major competitors around the world. And so while U.S. manufacturing exports have increased, our relative market share in the global economy has been on the decline. One of the most disturbing trends that our manufacturers are facing is the higher relative barriers that our exporters face compared to exporters from other countries. And a lot of that has to do with trade agreements that other countries have negotiated that exclude and disadvantage the United States. U.S. exporters face higher tariffs than nearly 130 other countries around the world, including China, Mexico, Canada, and every member state of the European Union. The United States' failure to negotiate new trade agreements while our competitors are discussing dozens of these agreements that exclude us is one of the biggest culprits. This failure to move forward on strong new trade agreements is particularly problematic when you look at the history of trade agreements for the United States. When we've negotiated comprehensive high-standard trade agreements, as we have with 20 countries around the world, American manufacturers and other industries in the United States and our workers succeed. Nearly half of all U.S. manufacturing exports go to just 20 countries. Those 20 countries represent 6% of the world population, only less than 10% of world GDP. Who are they? They're the 20 countries that have eliminated tariff and non-tariff barriers, that have agreed to high standards, that have entered into high standard free trade agreements with the United States. We have a manufacturing trade surplus with those 20 free trade agreement partners. Trade agreements are powerful sources of growth, of jobs for our nation's manufacturers, but also for others around the world. And that takes me to TTIP. Already, the United States and EU account for about half the global economy, and we share a very vibrant trade and economic and investment relationship. U.S. exports to the EU account for about 17% of total U.S. manufacturing exports at about $236 billion. That's a lot. It's our second largest manufacturing export market after North America. EU manufacturing exports to the United States equaled about $356 billion in 2013. Overall, we exchange over $5 billion in goods and services annually. And investment, cross-border investment between the United States and EU member states is over $3.7 trillion and is really one of the biggest drivers of growth and jobs in both economies. Before the TTIP talks began, there was a desire in both the United States and EU to promote jobs and growth. We had just come out of, or starting to come out of, a very bad financial crisis and recession. And we had just seen and perhaps realized, maybe not just seen, but realized that there was a stalemate in the global Doha trade negotiations, and that efforts to liberalize trade and grow trade with all of our major trading partners was at a standstill. So a high-level working group between the United States and EU issued a report in February of 2013. Many of you may remember it. And what that report did was it emphasized how a comprehensive, ambitious, market-opening, high-standard TTIP would promote opportunities for jobs, commercial opportunities, economic growth, and generate new business and employment on both sides of the Atlantic. As a result, both countries began the TTIP negotiations. And we at the NAM couldn't agree more that that type of trade agreement that was envisioned at the very beginning is exactly what we need to move our economies forward. Tariffs between the United States and EU are relatively low. We've been leaders in the global infrastructure at the WTO in reducing our tariffs. But because we have so much trade bilaterally, eliminating tariffs would save about $10.5 billion on both sides of the Atlantic. The regulatory differences that Chuck alluded to, and which I think is on everyone's mind and is something that is very difficult for manufacturers. Consider if you're a manufacturer in the United States and you have to have two different production lines working to make products for the United States and then a separate product for the EU. Ultimately, the product is the same. It carries many of the same safety and technical standards, but because of differences in the way regulations and standards have developed in the United States and EU, there are these small differences that don't mean much to the end consumer, but they cost manufacturers a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of duplication that simply makes us less productive and less competitive in the global economy. So even a modest alignment of regulatory standards between the United States and EU is projected to increase combined GDP by over $106 billion. And then there's the rules, issues like the protection of intellectual property, which is a lifeblood for our nation's manufacturers and those who want to create innovative new technologies that we all rely on increasingly. Investment protection, the biggest part of the US-EU relationship is our cross-border investment, but we also have investments around the world that help propel our exports, that support our research and development here in the United States. Transparency, where the United States and EU have gone beyond most other countries, but haven't agreed to these rules between ourselves. And then, of course, there's the newer issues, the mobile e-commerce issues. If you're a small manufacturer, one of the best ways you have to reach new customers overseas is putting up a global platform on the internet. But to be able to use that effectively, you need to have data move back and forth. You need to have cloud computing options that are cost efficient and effective. So these rules that many of you may have heard talked about, cross-border data flows or preventing the localization of information technology infrastructure, are hugely important to manufacturers as well to communicate with, to reach new customers, and certainly when you have operations on the ground. This is an opportunity for the United States and EU to set the global standard on these rules. Some of these rules we've negotiated, some, as Chuck mentioned, intellectual property and the WTO, but we can go beyond that because both of our own systems respect these things so much more. But in recent weeks, months, we've seen some serious questioning, as Chuck alluded to. We've had a new European Parliament elected that seems to have more folks from either extreme than before. We have a new commission that where there's been some questions about some of the core principles, and some of the member states have wondered whether it really should be that comprehensive, or do we need to take certain issues off the table, be it particular sectors like audiovisual or particular rules like the investment rules that the United States and EU have each crafted over decades. And there's a new wave, as Chuck mentioned, of anti-trade critics sweeping over Europe. But for manufacturers here in the United States, the reason for starting these talks is even more compelling than it was back in 2013. The U.S. economy is doing better, but continued growth is not certain. Unemployment has been growing, but we all want to see greater economic activity that's going to create the certainty, that's going to create the opportunities so that manufacturers and other businesses can start hiring more employees here in the United States. In Europe, we continue to see a very weak recovery. The Commission's fall forecast that was released on Tuesday projected that the Eurozone economy is projected to grow 0.8% this year and 1.1% in 2015. The October market PMI index, which is a manufacturing index that provides insights into economic trends, showed that the Eurozone manufacturing sector remained in a state of near stagnation. And new orders were contracting in August. Major countries, Austria, France, Italy, and Greece, were contracting. More broadly, we've seen the IMF reduce global growth worldwide, and the WTO reduce global trade forecasts. This weak recovery, particularly in Europe, is an important backdrop to these negotiations, particularly on jumpstarting new economic opportunities, eliminating unnecessary tariffs, regulatory differences, setting in place strong standards on those issues that help propel innovation and economic growth. That's what's needed right now. And that's what the TTIP was started to do. That was the original vision. And we believe that that has never been more true. And in a global economy that's very weak, the ability to improve the competitiveness of manufacturers and other businesses in the United States and Europe vis-a-vis each other will also help us compete in that very difficult, broader global economy. So we in the United States, from the manufacturing sector, are very strongly looking for the type of reinvigoration of this negotiation. They've done a lot of work, the negotiators, already. We have strong trade ministers, and both Ambassador Froman here in the United States and the new EU Trade Commissioner Malmström. But what we need are some things to help us move this forward. Let me just give you three. First, folks here in the United States can do a lot to jumpstart these talks by moving forward as fast as you can on enacting new Trade Promotion Authority legislation. I don't believe that TPA has held up in any way the TTIP talks, but the signal that Trade Promotion Authority approval by strong majorities in the House and the Senate would show to the European governments would be very, very helpful at this stage of the game. We want to see, as NAM, TPA for a lot of different reasons, but if we want to level the playing field, if we want to make sure that our producers here in the United States are not facing the highest tariffs when they're going overseas, we need Trade Promotion Authority, and we need it as soon as possible. Second, we need the leaders, both in Europe and the United States, that began these negotiations to remind everybody, remind their negotiators what this is all about. This is about jobs and growth. And to do that, the negotiators need to stick to the original focus on a comprehensive, ambitious, broadly market opening and high standard outcome. Finally, I'd mention the one issue where we see great promise, but also the most difficult part of these negotiations in many respects, and that's the regulatory side. This is where we need that leadership guidance to our regulators and to businesses. Chuck mentioned that there's a lot of work going on between US and EU businesses to talk about what are the sectoral outcomes that we would like to see that would actually help make us all more competitive and more efficient and productive. There's a lot of work being done both on, as well on the horizontal regulatory transparency and procedural sides. There needs to be more attention paid to this at higher levels to get this part of the negotiations on track now so that we can get these negotiations moving towards the ambitious outcome that we all believe would really help promote both our economies.
Linda, thank you. Kathryn?
Well, hello, everyone.
Would you just
Oh,
press
yeah.
your button? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here. I certainly agree with nearly everything that Chuck and Linda have said. Bob asked me to kind of play a different role on this panel to kind of lay out some things that could be done as part of this reset. So rather than the cheerleading for Go Team Go, I'm going to try and lay out a couple of ideas that have been swirling around in my small brain about how we can use this reset time. First point I want to make is I think it's really terrific that the new Trade Commissioner Malmstrom and Mike Froman have agreed that they need a reset. I think that that shows some realism on their parts, that 7 rounds of negotiations haven't really produced much. A lot of great work has been done, and I agree with Chuck that our negotiators have done a phenomenal job. This is not a critique of the people, but more of the process. So as Malmstrom and Froman are going through this process, I really urge them to go back and reread the report that was issued in, if you can believe it, 1971, when Bob Vastine was around as a young man, called the Williams Commission. Chuck was around too, I believe. The Williams Commission was a body. Was a body that was started in the Nixon administration in 1970. It was called the Commission on International Trade and Investment Policy, and it brought together a group of business, labor, and academics who spent about a year under the chairmanship of Albert Williams of IBM. And they produced a report in 1971, and I think the opening statement is as true today as it was then. They said, the world has changed radically from the one we knew after World War II. We believe it is imperative that the United States, in its own interest, bring its international trade and investment policies into line with the new realities. The Williams Commission then it set out the whole way to deal with tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers that were then taken up in what was called the Nixon round, and then after he resigned, renamed the Tokyo round. And the concluding statement from the Williams Commission said that the core of the present difficulty is the fact that government policies and practices and international arrangements for collective decision-making have not kept abreast of the high degree of international economic interaction which has been achieved since World War II. The reason I think it's important that Froman and Malmstrom go back and reread the Williams Commission report is that the changes in the global economy that were apparent in the early 70s were as transformational then as what we're seeing now. And I think part of the problem we've gotten stuck on TTIP is our negotiators went into the negotiations with the mindset of trade negotiators. What do trade negotiators do? They negotiate on what they know. I know, I was a USTR negotiator. It's what you do, it's what you're rewarded for. What the negotiators didn't have access to or didn't fully bring into their negotiating approach was the way the global economy has been transformed in the last decade, and more importantly, how we want the US and EU to behave in the global economy 10 years out when this agreement will fully come into effect. So what we're doing is we're negotiating from an old mindset about trade. What do we know? Economists on both sides of the Atlantic have spent a lot of time and a lot of money looking at the trade relationship between the US and the EU. And it's no real surprise here. Dan Hamilton and Joe Quinlan have been talking about this for a long time. It's not about trade anymore. Yoo-hoo, it's about investment. And the way American companies deliver goods and services to European customers is through foreign affiliates. The way European companies deliver goods and services to American consumers is through foreign affiliates. Yes, we send a lot of containers across the Atlantic, and yes, these tariffs matter. They're low, big volume, makes a big difference, but that shouldn't be the driving focus of these negotiations. It has to take into account the transformation of the internet. And so when I look at what the negotiators have been talking about, cross-border data flow, which is fundamental to our lives now, as you're all sitting there reading your iPhones, we have to make this front and center of what we're trying to do. Otherwise, we know that China is going to come up with its own system, which will disadvantage American and European companies. So let's get real and let's start focusing on the big things that matter. I will just give a footnote as I was rereading the Williams Commission. It's very interesting to me that after the Williams Commission was their final report was presented, the international community endorsed it. It was picked up by the OECD, and in 1971, they formed a study group by the Council of Ministers under the leadership of Jean Rey, who was the former president of the European Commission and a trade negotiator. And he brought together 11 prominent individuals from academia, business, and labor to advise the OECD. They put out their study group, and then that formed the consensus for launching the Tokyo round. So what I'm trying to suggest here is there is a way for us to return to the things that matter, and I believe we have to focus on the big stuff that matters. I think it is a crime that we have spent so much time with the Europeans arguing about geographical indications. I just don't see the job and growth impact that settling geographical indications is going to have for our economy in 2014. Yes, it's an issue that if you're in the wine industry or the ag industry, you really care about, and that's terrific, but show me the jobs and growth lift we're going to get from solving that old issue. Same thing with audiovisual restrictions in France. Yeah, it's a shame, but they're French. Come on, there are more American movies that are screened in France than you would believe. The studios don't really find this a major issue, but it's one of those things that trade negotiators have had on the inventory of non-tariff barriers, remember Tim, forever, and so therefore we have to talk about it. And I just think, come on, let's focus on the stuff that matters. Why? Because as Linda was saying, and we really didn't coordinate this, the focus has to be on jobs and growth. And I have the same articles from the paper yesterday that show the European growth is actually down from the spring estimates. We're 1.2% in the Eurozone now to 0.8, down from 1.6 for the overall European market, including the UK, from 1.6 down to 1.3. It makes the US growth, which 15 years ago we all would have considered 3.1 growth pretty anemic. But compared to Japan at 0.8%, China 7.1%. I mean, we have got to stay focused on what matters. So let's think about a basic question. Who creates jobs? And let's focus on that segment of our transatlantic economy. The group that creates jobs is not big business and not small business. It's the medium-sized companies in both the US and EU. This is a tier of companies that range from 50 million to $1 billion in revenues. Their employment growth is expected to be 3.5% this year. Their revenue growth is 9%. These are 200,000 companies across the United States. That's only 3% of all companies, but they account for 33% of private sector GDP. And 60% of all new job creation is done by these middle market companies. You don't hear anything in the negotiations about this tier of companies. Some of these are household names, some of these are nationally, internationally known, some are regional. Tootsie Roll, Facebook, Airstream, travel trailers. These are big companies that employ people, that are innovative, that are driving technology development, and we need to do something in this TTIP to really focus on this group, because that's where you're going to get the job growth, where you can measure the success. Because up to now, we've had nothing in TTIP that tells us when we have a successful agreement. And if you don't define what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve other than free trade, it's very hard to then build that coalition of support around it. So a couple of final points. I think it's really important in TTIP that we keep the I in TTIP and continue to focus on the investment side. As I said, the world has really changed. Part of the frustration that I see with the negotiations is that the US and EU independently develop their own mandates. We now have been able to read the mandate that de Gucht had for entering into TTIP, and to me it is cast in concrete circa 1983. It says, yeah, they support a comprehensive and ambitious agreement, but we're not going to change a single law. We're not going to change a single regulation, and it has to be a single undertaking. I really urge us to rethink whether that old construct, the way we've done FTAs with little countries on both sides, we've never done one with an equal, whether this old mentality makes any sense for the economy of 2014, 2020, 2025. And think that we need to redefine what comprehensive means and what success means. Because if the impetus, if the real reason we're doing this is to boost jobs and growth in our highly integrated economy, then wouldn't you think you would eliminate tariffs? Do it! Wouldn't you think you would pursue regulatory cooperation in a few select areas and get on with it and do it? The idea that we have to hold everything to some final big party where we can pop champagne corks, to me doesn't seem to be the dynamism that our economies are really showing. So those are some ideas that I hope will stimulate some conversation, because it's been great to think about all this stuff. So Tim, turn it back to you.
Good. Thank you, Kathryn. Thanks to the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, because we do need programs like this, and we're going to need more of them over the next 12 to 18 months. The awareness of TTIP in Europe is pervasive, both in the EU28 and in the EFTA countries, and in Turkey, and in Canada and Mexico. All are following it very closely, as is a team within the Chinese government in Beijing and within the Japanese government. Following it very, very closely, working the town, representatives have probably knocked on many of your doors coming in for your insights on the evolution of this process. So while much of the world is following it closely, here in the United States, the awareness, I think it was a poll that came out on July 1st found that only 9% of the American population is aware of TTIP. They don't know what TTIP stands for, but generally aware. And the pollster said at a meeting with members of my group that they feel the real number is about 5% of the American population is aware of TTIP. That other 4%, when they were asked a question on the phone, and they asked about 1,200 phone calls, said, have you ever heard of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, et cetera, et cetera? And the person just did a quick mental calculation, think, oh, now I have. So they think that 4% of that were people who just immediately said, oh, yes, now I've heard of it. So the awareness here is very low. So we do need these type of programs. And one thing that's very gratifying for today, it's no surprise to you, you see the position I currently hold. I'm a very strong supporter of TTIP, a big believer in it, and a believer that it will happen, and it's going to happen sooner than many of the pundits believe. And what is nice, you've heard almost uniformly from this panel, very insightful comments and observations about different aspects of it, but a general belief of the importance of moving forward on this. So I'm going to make, since a lot of terrain has already been covered, I'm going to make then a few tweaks on the side on some of the comments. And one, I think it's very, very important to think of why did the U.S. and the EU, after considering this for so long, I mean, really after the NAFTA process, and then Vice President Gore announced that the U.S. was going to proceed with the free trade over the Americas, which caught most people off guard, then all of a sudden, oh my God, U.S. and EU, we got to do something. And as Chuck and Linda and Kathryn have all mentioned, the U.S. and the EU had years and years of debates over small stuff. But it was very, very difficult negotiations. There was canned fruit and wheat flour and sugar, and
Don't forget
you know, the banana war with Chiquita that Charlene Barshevsky knows so well, negotiating that, and you know, the pickup trucks and the chicken parts and all that. It just goes on and on. These little discrete issues that became, you know, just really nasty, to the point where when I was posted in Brussels, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline, U.S. and European Community, the EC at that time, on verge of trade war. So just to give you context, and context is really important in thinking of this particular agreement, because I'm going to move you forward. You've heard from Chuck about you have the two giants. And you know the difficulty in when you have equals. The EU has negotiated among these, I don't know, there's 500 plus now preferential trade agreements that have been negotiated. But the EU has been a major player, but they've always been in a powerful position and do a lot of dictating. That's certainly the historical position of the U.S. when negotiating its FTAs. When you have TPP, what is TPP doing? Well, TPP is fundamentally trying to bring standards up to a certain level among 12 negotiating partners. TTIP is two very large economic partners that already started at a very high level and are now trying to take it forward. So that's your degree of difficulty. Very high levels of economic development, well-established cultures that have had international appeal and influence, each believing that they are a world leader and that they reach that level because of their innate abilities and the correctness of their particular approaches. So you come together in this major trade negotiation that's comprehensive and ambitious, and everything's on the table, and it becomes difficulty on who, you know, who moves, who gives, so to speak, with that traditional trade negotiator mentality that Kathryn pointed to. So why did these two giants enter into this negotiation? We've heard almost the three previous speakers all touch upon it with differing degrees of detail. But it was first and foremost jobs and growth. The Great Recession was ongoing, and it still has an impact on both sides to varying degrees. But you heard statistics from Linda and Kathryn recently put out by Eurostat. The projections for economic growth in Europe are not good. They're constantly being revised downwards. A new report just came out on Tuesday by Eurostat that 1 out of 4 EU citizens at risk of poverty, and the number's growing. So there's clearly, in this economic crisis, governments only have so many macroeconomic tools to deal with something that is so large. They've used fiscal policy, they've used monetary policy. I think a good argument can be made that trade policy is the last remaining large macroeconomic policy that these two sides have to try and address this unbelievable challenge of reinvigorating economic growth to levels where it generates large numbers of new jobs and getting people back out of poverty and having sustained economic growth. A second reason, the international rules. This was clearly stated in the report that Kathryn mentioned, the high-level working party report on jobs and growth that was the foundation document that led to the launch of the TTIP negotiations. It said a second reason was to help move out the frontier of the architecture of the international trading rules. And that comes back to the point where you already have the two that are already fairly high level faced with, and the two historic drivers of the GATT system and then the WTO system. The WTO, now paralyzed organization, looking awful similar to the UN General Assembly, to the point of crisis that its current Director General last Friday stated that the the institutional future of the WTO is now at risk. That's what we're dealing with there. We saw what happened July 31 when India blocked the implementation of the Bali agreements and the trade facilitation agreement. Something fundamental to everyone with which you would think that, all international trading countries would benefit. So what are the chances of ever again seeing a major multilateral trade negotiation within the context of the architecture that's been established since World War II, the WTO? Personally, I would think it's slim to none. So we move towards large, what would move the architecture out the most? And we have 50 years of evidence that trade liberalizing agreements generate greater economic growth and greater job creation than otherwise would occur. So how do you then, what tool do governments have? We have to give governments credit in trying to think this through. How do they serve their populations? How do they serve their national economic interest? Well, large regional economic agreements seem to be the next best model. And that's what you're seeing pursued in the Asian basin and between the U.S. and the EU. So that is why a second primary motivating force for the TTIP that was thought of a few years ago and this summer, and the statement by Acevedo as recently as last Friday reinforces that, yes, that it remains a very important and valid reason why to pursue this. And third, one that got very little attention until Mr. Putin got very aggressive, and that is the geopolitical aspect. Let's face it, there were seminars in this town in the first 2 months of this year about the future of NATO isn't needed any longer. Resources, budgetary resources going to NATO and defense budgets have been declining like crazy. So the belief that, well, the European institutional framework is fairly comfortable, peaceful, even though it's non-implementation of the Paris Agreement of 1990, but still, the belief that we might not even need NATO. Well, I think we've all been disabused of that. And what we have seen because of crises in North Africa, Middle East, and in Eastern Europe, that a strengthened U.S., European/EU political relationship is just as important now as it ever was. So the three original reasons of just a few years ago when it was launched: jobs and growth, improve the international trading rules, and strengthen the geopolitical relationship are every bit as strong today as they were when the decision was made by President Obama and President Rompuy and Barroso to move forward with this negotiation. Now, urgency. You can get a sense of urgency from those three original motivations because the problems are still there. I would say also, with the results of Tuesday's election, that the occupants of the White House probably feel an even greater sense of urgency in coming up with some type of accomplishment for a political legacy. I make this comment to this audience because this is an audience that understands that and lives it every day. These are obtainable, achievable legacy accomplishments, TPP and TTIP, whether both or just one of them. But they are good for the overall national economic interest and the national security interest, and for that reason, I think the administration will push for them. On the European side, the sense of urgency is probably even greater. You heard the statistical projections, and it's not just right now. If you project out 5 years, if you project out 10 years, which is very dangerous to do, but I'm not an economist, so I'll go ahead and do it. If I'm an economist, I probably would do it with greater sense of knowing what I was talking about. But the projections for economic growth and job creation in Europe are not good at all, as far out as you want to project. I've sat in on numerous sessions, as Kathryn used to do, in Europe at think tank sessions and with government officials making this comment, and they all sit there and go, yeah, we agree with you. So Europe, the European Union, needs this agreement. You don't have to have the same sense of urgency when you go into it. That could be true in any relationship, perhaps. But Europe needs this agreement and needs it soon. And second comment I make on that is that Euroscepticism, we saw it manifest itself in the parliamentary elections in May. It continues to grow. The original hope of the European Union was to create greater economic growth greater wealth than would occur without this integrated European market. It's not delivering on the promise right now. It's leading to increased nationalism, populism, right-wing movements. The group of groups, for example, in the UK, UKIP, calling for the exit from the European Union. Angela Merkel last week saying to David Cameron, well, if you keep pushing on restrictions on immigration, then I won't block you leaving the European Union. Go ahead and leave. So, this is a stew, a nasty stew, that is really brewing in Europe. The new president of the European Union just recently called the new commission, which just took office on November 1st, the Last Chance Commission. What a staggering statement in your very first week in office. But that he was encapsulating his belief and the belief of many others at the Commission that the European Union and the Commission must start delivering more in the area of economic growth and job creation and improvement in wealth and wealth generation. So reasons why I think the European side will remain strong pushing for this agreement. Now, in terms of overall progress, you've already heard it, but my observation on this is with this audience, we've got a mix of congressional staff, corporate representatives, lobbyists. You all know, because you were all participants in it, as all of us were in our careers, that a lot of the work, most of the work, happens at the staff level. We do the research, we consult with private sector, from business to NGOs. We have to sift through piles and piles of data, work through interagency processes, consult with legislative committees, whether Congress or the European Parliament, in order to come up with negotiating positions, move into negotiation, and then continue the consultation. It's massive work. The top political level doesn't have time for that. They depend upon very talented staffs to do it. That work is going forward. That work has been continuing. Despite the European election, the parliamentary election, the change in the commission, midterm elections here, a lot of that staff work is continuing. So, the press articles saying the talks are stalled, nothing's happening. Not true, not true, not true. The degree of progress in these 26 negotiating groups is very uneven. Some are doing nothing. Financial services, the U.S. won't even talk. Investment protection, the European Union cannot come to the table right now because they're in the middle of an internal consultative procedure. Labor mobility, they can't move on that because the U.S. side is afraid of immigration reform on its side. But, so there are different reasons why, there are different speeds, I'll say, within these negotiating groups. But it doesn't mean at the end of the day, it won't all come together. And then my final comment is, I actually have two. I like the point that Kathryn made. One thing that's bothered me, in coming into this negotiation, the mental approach should have been different than all previous trade negotiations for the reasons that have been pointed out here. These were two large, developed economies. The negotiators knew each other well, so you didn't have to go through a mating dance for 6 months of getting to know them, their personalities, et cetera, et cetera. They worked together on this high-level working party report. They should have come to the table day one ready to get to it with a shared commitment to what needed to be achieved because of these severe economic crises and the faltering nature of the WTO. And I think what we're seeing is the trade negotiator mentality is what we're seeing at the table, where they're seeing it as an adversarial negotiation. I'm not going to get it unless, it's like the Three Stooges, and all that. Instead of sitting at the table, all right, here is the huge problem we need to address. Let's get with it, and let's create this more integrated transatlantic economic community with economic benefits for all. Then final comment is on timeline. And some of you know, I've been saying this for quite some time. I think the definition of tank of gas is the substantive negotiation will be completed in 2015. By this time next year, you will have a text that the negotiators will be ready to initial on each page. It's then going to have to go through legal scrub, language translations in Europe, and then translate into legislative language, get to the Congress, get to the Parliament. But this negotiated text, there's no reason it cannot be completed before the end of 2015. And I think that's the time frame the Commission is on. And from Ambassador Froman, when asked, I was at a meeting where he was asked about it and said, well, the Commission's saying this should be, can be done by the end of 2015. What do you think? He said, I guess that's the definition of one tank of gas.
Tim, thank you. So we'll now turn and open it to questions. from the floor. Yes, would you please identify yourself?
Yes. Bradford from Inside U.S. Street. One of the things that has been mentioned is that, with this fresh start, Mr. Levy, you mentioned that there has to be this kind of coalition between the private sector and the government. And I was just wondering, how exactly can that coalesce? What is being done to create that coalition and move these negotiations forward? And that question is extend to everybody.
I think it's just the function. I think it's a function that it goes on. It's conversations. I don't think there's some sort of strategic plan. I think that private sector and government should just keep talking with each other, and the more they talk with each other, deeper the conversation becomes. I think there are some issues which maybe will be dealt with in TPA about the whole consultation process here. But I think it's an ongoing effort. I think that each type of issue has its own dynamic. It's just that I think my comment was generic in the sense that each of the sectors needs to have its own plan of how it relates to their European counterparts and to the governments. And the deeper that relationship is, the better. I think the more you have the ability to overcome some of the sclerosis that's affected the negotiations.
I would just add that part of the reason industry groups on both sides of the Atlantic have come together to develop joint positions, and this is actually to me, one of the most exciting changes and developments in TTIP. The reason they've done that is that they're already integrated in global supply chains. And so the issues that they're confronting are all part of the global economy. And it is really terrific to have the chemicals and the insurance and the automobiles and all these other pharmaceutical sectors coming up with joint recommendations to both governments. In fact, it strengthens the ability for the US and EU to do some joint problem solving rather than head-to-head negotiation, I win, you lose. And that's part of changing this approach that is so important, because the industries can't afford to have a US industry position that's different than their European partners. So having this come together is a really great development, and it's having spillover effects now in TPP, which is pretty cool. But it is really the heart and soul of what the transatlantic economy is today and where it'll grow in the future, and we need to harness that.
And if I could just build on that, there's a lot of work sector by sector, but one of the issues where early on there was a lot of work together by U.S. and EU business organizations was dealing with trade secret theft. This is an issue. There's legislation in both the House and the Senate, both on our domestic system, but also on the importance of growing the disciplines on this in the international area. This is a form of intellectual property that if someone steals it, you're never going to get it back. It's, the secret sauce, the secret recipe. But for manufacturers, it's also the production processes and how things are done. And it's vitally important. Both the United States and European Union have a desire domestically, but also internationally, to improve the rules and to provide remedies in the case of trade secret theft and to create deterrence. And so that was something that U.S. and EU industry jointly brought to negotiators on both sides of the Atlantic to say, this has to be part of an approach on intellectual property going forward.
My comment would be, there are going to be limitations in terms of this idea of a coalition or something. This agreement has energized all kinds of groups. If you see some of the groups that are concerned about TTIP or opposed, they now have a list in Europe, this ECI, that's got 200 groups, and it's from a whole list of religious groups, animal welfare groups, space alien groups. It's unbelievable. But what that reflects is there's a lot of concern and there's a lot of mistrust towards governments and towards big companies. And I think that primarily is a reflection of the fact that we don't have the economic growth that a lot of workers wish we had.
Follow going to play a role in how willing the U.S. government will be in these negotiations?
I mean, I would say that Tuesday's election really gives the United States the best chance to put forward the type of robust trade policy that we've been lacking over the past number of years. Yes, we've had strong negotiations, but without that Trade Promotion Authority framework, which was last passed in 2002, lapsed in 2007, we've not negotiated a new market opening trade agreement since. That this new Congress really has the chance to move that forward. We know there's strong support for TPA in House Republican leadership, Senate Republican leadership, key Democrats in both the House and the Senate, and in the administration. And so this is, as a lot of the reporting has been done, trade and Trade Promotion Authority in particular is one of those issues that really seems like it can move. And as I said at the beginning, for manufacturers, we've got, 95% of our consumers are outside of our market. We face an unlevel playing field in every country in the world where we don't have a free trade agreement. Trade Promotion Authority is about leveling the playing field and having a pro-manufacturing trade policy.
In the back?
Hi, my name is Melanie Ford. I'm a student at the University of Maryland. My question is for anyone and everyone on the panel. The proposal to include investor-state dispute settlement in the TTIP has become quite controversial, and prominent people and organizations in the EU and the US have spoken out against it. And I was wondering what you all think, given that ISDS has become kind of a third rail issue for TTIP. Do you think negotiators should consider dropping it so as to move forward with an overall deal, or is TTIP not worth having without ISDS?
So if you missed my blog post on Investor State last week after the World Series, right? So Giants fans and Royal fans too understood the need for a neutral referee or umpire on the field. That's what Investor State is. I know there's a lot of mythology out there about it, and we're happy to talk about it. This is a process that Europe actually developed over 30 years ago, and the United States has, to make sure that when our companies go overseas, that those same basic rights that both of our legal systems in the US and EU have at their core, non-discrimination, due process, fair treatment, compensation if the government seizes your property, that they have a neutral referee when a foreign investor is potentially treated badly by a foreign government. This is something that's not controversial. It's in over 2,600 treaties around the world. There has been a vocal minority about this since I sat on the Senate Finance Committee for Senator Moynihan in the 1990s. But in reality, this is a part of our international legal system. It's something that's widely respected. And when you have a U.S.-EU trade investment relationship of $3.7 trillion, having this good system is really useful.
Yeah, well, Linda is, to me, one of the foremost experts on this issue, so I always like reading her blogs and the things that she writes. But I think she just made a very important point. Look, this is not a new debate. This debate has gone on for 25 years in the United States, in fact, even longer than 25 years. I don't see the apocalyptic arguments that are made by people against it. Well, I haven't seen any of those predictions come true in the United States or any other country. So people want to debate it again? Fine, we'll have another debate. It goes to my point of we'll have a debate, and what has to be is political leaders, as they've done in the United States, both Democratic and Republican members of Congress, Democratic and Republican presidents have said, as Linda just said, it's a good thing, and I will stand up to the opponents, and we'll just have this debate again. I'm sorry, we have to have the same debate. Every time there's a trade agreement, the same debate, and yet the world hasn't collapsed because of it.
I would just say, what's the alternative? If you don't have, I would just say, what's the alternative? If you don't have the impartial umpire, to use your analogy, you politicize the process. Who wants corporations going to politicians up here on the Hill, ambassadors overseas, whatever they can do to get a political solution? Why is that better? So the idea of an impartial adjudicator here, umpire, seems to me to be the very best way we can ensure that the process doesn't cause a chilling effect in investment. Because we've already been through all the job creation benefits of foreign direct investment in our two economies.
I was just going to say, I mean, trade debates produce some of the most extraordinarily interesting arguments. The last issue that was debated in the NAFTA debate was whether NAFTA permitted Mexico to take all our water from the Colorado River. So, I mean, fine, people want to have this debate every time there's a trade. It's a shame, it's a waste of time when we could be looking at more important issues, but the facts are there and there's no basis to the opponents just have yet to make a new argument that has any basis. So, fine, we'll have the debate again.
It is such a big issue, so I'll go ahead and weigh in on this. And in Europe, what you do here is, where there's tremendous concern about the issue, you hear one, and it's the subject of massive misunderstanding, miseducation. The opponents of ISDS inclusion, that's really their stalking horse, I think, for opposition to TTIP in general. It's mainly the anti-globalization group that just has tremendous fears and concerns about increased globalization. But their two main arguments on ISDS in Europe are, one, that these are secret tribunals that just involve corporate lawyers, corporate-appointed lawyers in the governments. If that was ever true, it's certainly not going to be true on this agreement. The model bilateral investment treaty of the United States is available on the USTR website, and this agreement will provide for transparent procedures for appointing the arbitrators, third-party participation, amicus briefs, and then the second major criticism we hear in Europe and hearings of the European Parliament, where I've been testifying and people sitting beside me have made these allegations, and that is that through ISDS, it will force the European member state governments to change their regulations with respect to worker safety, consumer welfare, and environmental regulation. Nothing could be further from the truth. ISDS awards, if a finding on behalf of a plaintiff is that you get monetary compensation of a certain amount. There's never been a case where any regulation or law is forced to be changed.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Will Reinhardt with the American Action Forum. So I come to this much more on the privacy and data side, which obviously is kind of one of the major reasons why I've been keeping up with this debate. I actually kind of want to push back against something you said, Tim, because the majority of Americans, I mean, a large majority of Americans actually do not believe in the benefits of trade, despite the fact that you guys may be here. Only like 20% of Americans think that trade creates jobs. This is a Pew poll that came out earlier, it was in September. Only 20% believe that it creates jobs. Only about 17% believes that it actually benefits. So, I mean, like, it's very, very mixed on what individuals think. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, the two of the major issues that the Atlantic Council and the Barsman Foundation, their paper that came out earlier this year, talked about was the GMO issue and the privacy issue, which, of course, I agree we need to do a lot of work on that. But these are two issues where you have a public sentiment that there is some higher value at stake here for privacy, especially the Europeans. It's this idea of, the right to be forgotten. I mean, this is kind of related to this right to privacy. And with GMOs, this kind of sense that, GMOs themselves are related to, it's just this higher, I don't want to say higher level, but there's just a value trade-off here that a lot of people are very, very worried about. So I'm wondering how these types of ideas really get involved in these trade negotiations, and specifically how the sentiment of the countries that are dealing with their own regulations are actually affecting your guys' work personally.
I'll make two observations there, and you're absolutely right. You're seeing erosion of general support for trade. I saw that Pew poll that Bruce Stokes circulated. One, on the privacy, the data privacy issue is off the table. Both sides agree. So, but it relates to the cross-border data flows that Linda and Kathryn addressed, and it's extremely important. And Kathryn hit the nail on the head. Cross-border data flows is fundamental to all business globally, from micro, the person selling the handmade purses from their family room, to the big corporations. So I think you're going to aim, the negotiators are probably going to move towards some type of language recognizes the importance of limiting any restriction on the flow of data across borders while respecting national data privacy laws. So, how do you do that? How do you define that line? It's never been done, but I think there's going to be some recognition of that. But data privacy legislation itself is not on the table. And then on the concern about trade liberalization leading to job loss or wage suppression, what's different from TTIP is that you're basically negotiating with equals. So I think that's the difference between, I'm not taking sides, I'm just making an observation, between TTIP and TPP, is that you are basically negotiating between equals. So I think that argument will not play in the European Parliament debate or in the U.S. Congress debate.
And one of the polls that I directed to was one that the NAM commissioned in February that asked voting populations whether they would support the United States Congress and President working together to negotiate agreements to eliminate barriers overseas. And it was overwhelmingly in support. We all know it's how questions are asked, right? If Americans are concerned that trade is not delivering the jobs, then is the answer to stand still, or is it to move forward on trade promotion authority, on trade agreements like TTIP and TPP that will deal with the barriers that we do face overseas? I mean, we're very frank about the type of barriers we face. NAM just filed fairly extensive comments on the USTR's request on trade barriers overseas that they request every year. So I think there's a static look, but there's also what can we do to address the questions here. In terms of the regulatory issues, and Tim gave an important answer on the cross-border issue. I would just say overall on the regulatory issues, what is it that the U.S., what is it we're seeking out of these negotiations? We're seeking transparency in regulatory processes that allows for stakeholder input. Sounds pretty familiar to the Administrative Procedure Act here in the United States. We're asking that there be cost-benefit analyses of regulations, that they be science-based, right? Those were things that the United States and Europe said in that high-level working report back in February. And that, the real regulatory and standards differences on the sectoral basis are being worked at in a few different groups, starting with a few sectors. We're hoping to expand that beyond. But can we deal with some of those duplications and all the rest of it that's going on? So I think there's a great potential here for a strong trade agreement that's going to create jobs here in the United States, that's going to improve economic activity if we can actually focus on those issues as opposed to all the things that people don't want to be part of the agreement. We don't want this to be, as my colleague Chris likes to say, the incredible shrinking trade agreement.
So one last quick question.
Yes, very quick. Christy Hughes from Hauser for Mr. Levy. You said that you were talking about the TRIPS and the industry model of TRIPS. I mean, if there was an industry model for the TTIP, how would it look very different to what we know about the TTIP public labor?
I don't know.
What's the question?
If there was an industry model for TTIP now, would it look very different to what we already know?
I don't know because I don't see all, I mean, the TRIPS model was a very laser-like focus on a particular issue. TTIP has, unbelievable number of issues. So I think the work that's going on now is beginning to produce different models. So I don't know whether, I couldn't say today whether a model for regulatory coherence with respect to different sectors, whether it would look any different for the work that's been done, because I don't think all the work's been done yet. So I think it's a good question, but I think that's a question to see what are the groups doing and what are they putting on the table, and I don't think everyone's finished that process. So I just can't answer the question. Good question. I think it's actually someone is going to be a good dissertation issue. down the road.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our terrific panelists for the conversation today.